Hello. Welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast where we break false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. And this is your host, Georgina Rose. I am doing another solo episode this week. I am a perennialist and polytheist. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about thriving as a solitary practitioner and developing a solitary spiritual practice. But before I get into the actual show, I do want to give a really exciting announcement. So I am hosting another group trip with Trova Trip, where up to 24 members of my community will come with me to Greece to see esoteric heritage sites and generally build community and have fun. That registration is now open. There will be a link in either the YouTube descriptions or the show notes if you are listening on a podcasting platform. So if you're on a podcasting platform, check the description of this episode. There will be a link, and you can click on this link and sign up. The first few people to sign up are going to get a major discount, so if you're interested, don't hesitate. Without further ado, I'd like to get into the show because this is probably the longest outline I've ever written for a podcast. I have so much to say on this subject, and I can't wait to get talking. So I think we need to begin with defining what a solitary practice is. So solitary practice is pretty much what it sounds like. It's when you take parts of your mystic or occult or esoteric journey and you do them alone by yourself. And this as a concept, people act like is some really new thing, and it's not. People have been solitary practitioners since the dawn of religion, but generally people cite solitary occultism as something that emerged in the 1990s. The term solitary practitioner, as we know it today, was pretty much coined by a Wiccan writer named Scott Cunningham, who basically wrote this book, Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner, where he discussed how to do Wiccan rituals on your own in your bedroom. And this sparked a revolution in the occult community where an entire wave of occultists came in through the lens of Wicca, which now very few people are Wiccan. I'm not a Wiccan myself. But this moment in time is really important to discuss in relation to the subject. Basically, after his book came out, it sold an obscene amount of copies. I think it was millions. I think he might have sold 2 million at this point. And basically, it was this curriculum from start to finish about how to be a Wiccan by yourself. And a bunch of people became Wiccans in their bedroom. And previously, Wicca was done mostly in a group setting through a tradition called British traditional Wicca. Most commonly, you'll see Gardnerian Wicca and Alexandrian Wicca, which are two kind of traditions that popped off of British traditional Wicca. The original Wicca was Gardnerian. But basically, after this point, there became a tradition known as eclectic Wicca, which were solitary people kind of doing whatever they want. And then after this point in time, pretty much all the people who went into traditional Wicca had previously been solitary practitioners, which I just find so interesting. And the solitary practice now in the occult community is overwhelmingly the most popular way to practice. And I want to put this out there first. While I said a lot of people began solitary and joined groups, being a solitary practitioner is not lesser, and it does not mean you are having less spiritual growth. Some of the most profound mystics throughout history were not in organizations, they were just doing things by themselves. They may not have called themselves solitary practitioners, since this is a very new term, but it's a term I like since it's so direct and to the point. But yeah, it's been a thing for all of time. And there have always been solitary practitioners out there. I mean, a lot of like the great prophets or teachers or whatever you want to call them, or gurus, or I don't know what term you like, whatever you want to call them. A lot of them were solitary or kind of in a small group setting, like with one or two other people. The idea that all occultism occurs in orders is not true. And a lot of these occult groups that people kind of point to as institutions are not as old as you would think. So I now want to talk about my experience for a little bit, which is not something I often talk about on my podcast. But for this topic, I think it's worth bringing up. So I have been involved in both group and solitary occultism over the years. But personally, I actually lean solitary. There have been years of my life where I have been completely solitary. Right now, I am completely solitary. But I have also gone through groups. I've gone through an initiation. I've done a lot of the things that people think of as traditional pathways into occultism, right? I've been involved with an order. I've been involved with more casual covens that are not initiatory in a structure, and I've gone to group rituals that were not part of a group at all, right? Basically, like pickup rituals where it's a bunch of people who have different practices coming together to do a working as a group. Um, and I think that experience is really interesting because when I compare my mystical experiences that I have had by myself and in group settings, I don't actually think they're as different as they sound, because when you're having a group ritual and you have a spiritual experience, you're still also having a solitary experience. Like a lot of rituals where you will say invoke a goddess that are done in a group. There was one specific ritual I did. This would have been probably 2019. It was a Hecate group ritual that used a lot of PGM stuff. And it was a bunch of people who were not in like a organized group. Like it was not like an initiatory structured group. But it had time where you were kind of in your own head with the goddess. And so even though you were in a group setting, you were still having a solitary experience. And when I think to experiences I've had in groups where I've had the most profound moments, often those have been moments where I have been in a group setting that has then been a conduit to a solitary experience. As well, multiple of the most profound spiritual experiences I have been entirely by myself. So I strongly reject the idea that group settings are better. I do not think they are lesser either. I think both have value, and I think, and I'm going to get through this throughout the show, there are times when you will want to be in a group and times where you want to be solitary, and for some people, they will be group all the way, and for some people, they will be solitary forever. And neither of these are better or lesser than the other. They just have a different feeling to them and they affect you a little bit differently. Um, and I will be real, even if you are in a group, like you're someone who, say, is part of an order and you go to Gnostic Mass every single week and you do initiations like once a year, right? And you're really integrated in your local community and you're really having group experiences regularly, you're still gonna need a solitary practice. Because when you go through a traditional group, they're going to tell you to do specific practices or give you reading lists or give you advice on things to do by yourself. So even if you are in a group, that solitary dimension is really important. And you're gonna have times when you're gonna do rituals by yourself. I think the only way that someone could have a 100% group based practice is if they were able to go to that group like every single day, or they lived in like a commune type situation, which is so rare that I don't even know how to account for those people, because when I think of people in my life who I have met who are really group based practitioners and who really thrive in the group setting, every single one of them has a solitary practice. Every single one of them has an altar in their house. Every single one of them does things that divert from that group practice and have that component to it. So I think that the solitary practice stuff is a conversation everyone needs to be hearing, because I sometimes see people who have only been in group settings unsure how to have a solitary practice, or even worse, since they do not have any solitary practice, they're not doing daily rituals, they're not devoting time to that solitary practice. They kind of fall behind their peers that are in a group setting who also have a strong solitary practice. Now, there are a lot of reasons why someone would be solely a solitary practitioner. Um, because there's so many reasons. And I think some people in groups really look down on solitary practitioners as lesser, but there are many reasons why someone would only be solitary. And I kind of want to go through some of those. So, one, you live in an area where there is not groups or not groups that apply to your practice. This is where I'm at right now, right? For those who know anything about my personal journey, I lived in New York City for many years. The entire time I've done my channel and podcast, I've been living in New York until about 2 months ago, in which I actually, following a big rebirth ritual I did, moved across, well, I guess not across, but moved far away. And I live in Appalachia now. I live in the Virginia Blue Ridge area. I'm not saying exactly where I live because y'all don't need to know that. But where I am now, there really are not occult groups. It's just not a thing. And I've done some research. There are some like scattered groups here and there, but they're mostly not my particular practice. And so if you're in an area where there either are no groups, because there are a lot of people who live in like really remote areas where the nearest group might be hours and hours away, or they live in, say, I had a friend back in the day who lived in a city, but her practice was so different from everyone else in her city that whenever she actually went to groups, they didn't mesh with her. And when you go to find groups, I think people will be surprised as to what's out there, because if you are someone who is on the occult internet and that's most of your community experiences is just listening to podcasts, maybe being in discords or social media communities, you're going to see actually incredibly different practices represented than what exists in the material world. When you go out into a local region and you try to find groups, first of all, the most popular thing you're going to find is like witchcraft stuff, right? Not necessarily Wicca, since Wicca has really declined in popularity, though you probably will find Wicca because Wicca is still very popular among older crowds and older people. But you're going to find a lot of like eclectic pagan witchcraft groups, which, if you are not that practiced, I am not, you're probably not going to vibe as well with these people. You might be able to have some rituals with them, but you're not going to be able to progress with them through an initiatory structure that is going to benefit your personal practice in as profound a way. As well, I noticed that Nordic pagan or Ausatru groups are pretty much everywhere. The problem with that, though, is if you're not a Nordic pagan, and even if you are a Nordic pagan who just isn't Ausatru, like maybe you venerate the Vanir or whatever, you're probably not going to fit in with that crowd. As well, Thelema has a very powerful infrastructure. There's a lot of Thelemic groups around. They have a big hold on local communities. And Thelema is a very specific tradition. And so if you're a ceremonial magician who doesn't really relate to Thelema, that's probably not going to click with you. Theosophy has a pretty strong infrastructure, especially in major cities. There are groups like the Kabbalah Center, but the Kabbalah Center I really would not recommend for a bunch of reasons. They're strange and new agey and weird. But basically, like, you're going to see a lot of the same groups everywhere. As well, the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons are pretty scattered. If you're a woman, Freemasonry is completely out the picture, but honestly, they are kind of their own thing at this point. And they, as an organization, are losing steam, and there's all sorts of reasons why that would not be an option. But if you are in any of these traditions, you probably can find a local community that will be great for you. But if you're not, you're probably going to struggle. And I also think it's worth considering regions, right? In the Northeast versus in the South, very different types of paganism are going to be popular, right? So there's a lot of reasons why someone would be solitary. That's not just them not wanting to be in a group, right? Because I would say it is better to be solitary than to join a group that you do not vibe with. Because if you go deep enough into a group, you're going to pick up a lot of their practice and even take things like oaths, where you have to swear things and all sorts of stuff. So I suggest, when you're looking at groups, really discerning if they are what you want to be a part of. And if they're not, I don't think that's the right path for you, and that's okay. So those are all the major reasons why someone might not want to be in a group. There also are just people who are kind of hermity in their nature. They like doing things by themselves, and that's another big contingent too. Now, there are a few limitations to being a solitary practitioner, and those I'm going to talk about how to work with throughout this entire podcast. I think the one that people think of first when they think of limitations of being a solitary practitioner is this idea that solitary practitioners don't have initiations. This is not true. So, being a solitary practitioner, you will still have initiatory experiences. And I think a lot of this misconception comes from the fact that I think a lot of people picture initiation only happening in one way. They picture those occult order, like Golden Dawn, OTO type initiations where you initiate with a group of people and then you take oaths and you do all this thing. That's not the only way initiation works like. There are many experiences you will have that are initiatory that are completely different than that. There are some initiations that you don't even choose to happen to you. They just kind of get thrust upon you. Now, when you are someone who's wanting to choose an initiation, you're solitary, the idea of self-initiation is very popular now, and there are several formal occult groups that actually have self-initiation curriculum. Specifically, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn has a self-initiation track, and as well, there are like teaching order type setups who have self-initiations built in, and pretty much with many traditional traditions that are not just in the order form, that have like decentralized structures, self-initiation is an option where you'll be kind of given a ritual and you perform it by yourself, and it is that self-initiation. Now, you can do initiations in a non-traditional way that are not just pre-written self-initiations. You can do devotional rituals by yourself. You can do crossing the abyss type of rituals by yourself. You just have to be a little bit more creative with it and think outside of this basic paradigm of what an initiation is. As well, you can take oaths as a solitary practitioner. That does not have to be in a group setting, and there are specific oaths that will be taken on their own anyways. And oaths are like these formal promises that are kind of like doors that don't close, right? When you take an oath, that's this like permanent change to your spiritual psyche that's binding. Many oaths can be done completely by themselves. As well, if you are a solitary practitioner, an option for you would be finding just one or two other people in your area who you could do occasional group rituals with and coming up with like a decentralized group. That's also completely on the table. And with certain initiatory rituals, finding like one or two other practitioners can get that done and make that a little easier. But if not, ritual modification is something that you will want to learn as a solitary practitioner. I'll get into that in a bit. Um, so there are many rituals that are designed to be done solitarily. I think we should look at texts like the Greek magical papyri that are full of rituals. Many of those do not require other people. I think the vast majority do. As well, there are specific important benchmark rituals that you undertake during in your life that have to be solitary. So even if you're someone who has spent years and years in formal group infrastructure, there are certain rituals where you're going to have to go out on your own. The most famous of these is the Opera Melon ritual. So the Opera Melon ritual is this older ritual that is a very complicated technique on how to make knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. And the Opera Melon actually requires that the practitioner basically chooses voluntary hermithood for a number of months, to be in your head and be detached from distractions so that you can devote yourself fully to contacting that angel and making that communication. Similar rituals, like there's a ritual in Islamic hate mysticism where you maintain contact and gain contact with your Qareen, which is kind of like your guiding jinn or your spiritual double. It's a little bit of a different concept. Basically, the idea is that everyone has a jinn that is tethered to them, and that jinn is either a good or bad jinn, depending on the practitioner's moral framework and relationship to miasma and all that. Those rituals are solitary. There are many spirit rituals that I have read that require it to be done solitarily. There's, speaking of Gen magic, I'm going to stick on Gen magic for a little bit. To do divination through conjuring Jinn, through evocation, there's one specific one that I found. It was in the Jinn Sorcery book by Rain Al-Alim, where basically you say some Quran verses and you write some parchment and whatever, and you have to sleep. So basically the Jinn comes in your dreams and gives you the answer to your questions, like a divination type thing. And it says in the text, you must be sleeping alone by yourself for this ritual to work. And so in that case, that's mandated solitude. As well, when you are actually having interaction with a deity and you're having that transcendent experience, even if you're in a group, you're not really interacting with the group in the same way most of the time. There are some outlier rituals where your interaction with the group maintains once you've made that spirit contact, but in some cases, no. So there are probably like, I would say probably 90% of rituals out there you don't need to modify to be solitary because they're written to be solitary. If anything, some of these have modifications to be done in a group, right? Like if you're in a group ritual and you have to banish to open, right? You have to do your lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, to start the group ritual. One specific person is going to be the one who has to do the LBRP. And so everyone like sits there. This is what happens every time I've done a group ritual where the LBRP exists. Everyone either sits there and watches the person do the LBRP, or they have to be standing in another room while the person does the LBRP. And then you are invited into the temple ritual space to then perform the rest of the ritual. And when we look at group rituals, there often are specific like rules. Crowley liked the term dramatic ritual to refer to these type of rituals where there's kind of like a script and it's almost like performance like. There was this podcast that someone did forever ago where a bunch of these like normies who are non-occultist went to some OTO meetings and then just talked about their experience. And they said it looked kind of similar to Thedur because there was people like reading different ritual parts. In those cases, what you see is that not every single participant in the ritual space is doing everything at once, right? The responsibilities are delegated, they're spread out. And there are like these kind of providers or priests or priestesses who sort of lead the ritual by doing the bulk of the invocation. And so you can take all those sections and do them solitarily, because that is a solitary practitioner performing solitarity on behalf of the entire group. And then you'll see minority sections of the ritual where everyone speaks at once, right? So think about that and go, oh, wait, so there is a solitary experience within the group, right? And so when you get to the rituals that are not written to be done solitarily, right? Like they're written to be done by 2 people or 3 people or a whole group. A lot of those you can actually modify to be solitary. And when we talk about ritual modification, I would like to say if you are not a somewhat experienced practitioner, I would not modify rituals yourself, because when we look at ritual and how rituals are created, we're looking at like mathematical formulas of metaphysics, right? So Crowley explained these formulas really, really well in his book Magic and Theory and Practice. He like breaks down specific formulas. But basically, rituals are structures, right? Because we understand the metaphysical law of as above, so below, the macrocosm and the microcosm. And we are within the microcosm trying to impact the macrocosm. And we do that typically through the law of correspondence, or the idea that things represent other things. If you look at a drawing of the Kabbalistic tree of life, you'll see 8 million versions of it, with some having planetary glyphs and some having numbers and some having, I mean, you could do this endlessly. The most ambitious attempt of this, and the one that I suggest looking at when we're looking at correspondences or making ritual modifications, is Liber 777, which was one of Aleister Crowley's projects where he basically attempted to like create the Rosetta Stone of metaphysics. And so there's all these columns, and everything that's in the same line across the columns has the same correspondence, and thus you could substitute them for each other. I think the first ways that people do modifications is, say they're out of a specific incense, they use a corresponding candle instead. Basically, what you can do is make swaps. So take a ritual and look at the correspondences and go, so this uses frankincense. What is frankincense? Frankincense is purifying and it's solar, right? So what's something that can do that same function? And then you swap in something similar, right? It's just that on a more complicated level, right? Like, if let's say it's a divine masculine based ritual and you're a solitary female practitioner and you're like, okay, so I am not the correspondence of the male ritualist who's meant to be doing this ritual. How do I modify it? Well, I need to modify the correspondence of myself. And so a common way this specific modification is done is by taking an athame, which is a ritual knife or dagger, and strapping it to your waist. And so this represents having a phallus, making you now a masculinely charged ritual participant, right? And Wicca is where we get this idea from. They said that in a pinch, right, a female priestess could act out a male ritual role by doing this action. And that's why you get interesting ideas like the woman girt with the sword and specific things. It's a little more complicated, but basically saying that would be a modification, right? So look at all those correspondences. What type of person is it calling for? What ritual vestments is he calling for? What incense, candles, and then take all that and make appropriate swaps that build up to the same formula. You don't need to be crazy about it and like spend 18 years like studying numerology and memorizing Kabbalah. Like, it's a little more simple than it sounds. I know it sounds complicated at first, but once you start breaking down rituals, it makes more and more sense. So I really suggest practitioners who are solitary like read rituals regularly and take those old grimoires that everyone pins to, and don't only read them when you want to use them. Read them when you want to understand ritual formula and look at them and go, oh, that's what that is. That's why that's used. And the more rituals you read, the more you'll see through lines, right? The more you'll see the same things happening again and again. One common thing that you'll see repeatedly, and one of the things that I love to see in ritual, because I just think it's so clean, is the first few steps of the ritual will be repeated in reverse at the last few stages of the ritual. So something would open with the LBRP, then the LBRH, then your main ritual bulk. And then you'll see that LBRH right afterwards, and then your LBRP, right? It's like an opening and a closing. And so as a solitary practitioner, you need to get a sense of these formulations. As well, I think as solitary practitioners, the onus is on us to be studying a lot, right? You need to be more into doing the work and taking initiative because you have less people guiding you. And one of the other pitfalls that I think solitary practitioners fall into, and one of the things that you can consciously work away from, is the need to be taught. Because for us, we do need to do self teaching. And to do self teaching, you need to look to the experts, look to these great historic occultists, and read what they were doing. I know it's a little off the beaten path, but reading their journals can actually be incredibly insightful instead of just reading like copies of the ritual text or 101 books explaining what they did. Like reading what they were thinking, because when you see what they are thinking, you will see how it plays out in their lives. As well, when you are solitary and learning things like planetary timing or astrology, I really recommend learning those systems by watching them play out in your life, right? The way that I learned astrology and learned astrology in a way that stuck instead of just like memorizing horoscopes was to look at the current transits and see what's happening in my life and the lives of the people that I interact with, right? See all the people around you as case studies and see how it plays out. And as it plays out, you'll go, oh, that's what that means, right? There's so much we can learn from observation and seeing what other people are doing. Because when we talk about metaphysics, we are talking about, you know, our world as well. We're not just talking about these abstract ideas, right? Because if we believe in the law of as above, so below, which all occultists should and do because it's so essential. Oh my God, it's so essential. You'll see these things play out. And watching that is going to teach you so much. Now, since we've gone over kind of ritual modification, I think we should talk about creating your own rituals because when you are a solitary practitioner, you are at some point going to create your own rituals, right? I think creating your own rituals is really powerful because you can make something that's so specific to what's going on in your life and in your practice. I do not recommend creating your own rituals to people who are super new. But as you get more and more experience, learning to create is going to teach you so much because once you start making your own rituals, right, you'll be able to create that formula yourself. And then that formula, which is those building blocks of occultism, because these formulas come from metaphysical laws. And so learning these formulas teaches us so much about everything, right? You'll be able to apply it yourself and then see it work out. When you start creating your own rituals for the first time, right, after you have some ritual experience doing pre-written ones and pre-written spells and all that, I think the first thing you should do is do divination on the ritual before you start. So, what I would do is when you're new, create a very simple ritual or spell and base it around correspondences, right? So, use correspondence as your guiding principle because correspondence is the key to a lot of formulas, and correspondence is not that hard to understand. So, when you make your first ritual, use a basic formula, right? Like LBRP, main invocation, LBRP again. Don't add any extra steps. Like just make it really simple because simple can honestly be just as effective as the complicated thing. Those simple rituals will teach you so much. So when you get to that bulk part after you have, say, your LBRPs or your Star Ruby or your Circle, right, and you're at that main piece, look to correspondence. Go, okay, so what is my goal with this ritual? That's the first question you should be asking before you do any ritual, even pre-written rituals. Go, well, what is this going to do for me? Am I doing this just to connect to a god or am I doing this to get a specific goal? Let's say your goal is to start a new job, right? So what are the correspondences that are going to relate to starting a new job? Think about that. You're going to probably get Jupiterian or Mercurial things out of that. And then go, so what corresponds to Jupiter? Then pick the right color candle, the right color incense, and you can just open Liber 777 and see all of this information. You don't need to memorize it. I think a lot of people in occultism waste time memorizing instead of actually doing mysticism. The gods don't care if you've memorized every single candle correspondence. Focus on your actual spiritual growth and kind of put up your blinders around the distractions. So then you have that. You're like, okay, I've got all the correspondences together. Now, what am I going to do to time it? Correspondence, once again. So I'm going to do the Jupiter day. That's Thursday. And then I'm going to do the ritual in a Jupiter hour. Pull up the planetary hour calculator on Google and put in your longitude and latitude and click the button and you'll go, okay, so I'll do it at this time on this day. I'll light the Jupiter correspondence incense, candle, and then say the Orphic hymn to Jupiter. That's the easiest invocation you could think of, right? And then you're going to have that experience after that invocation, and then you're going to redo that LBRP that was at the beginning of that ritual again, And that's it. You've created your own ritual. It's very simple. Another way to create things that are easy is to do things like jar spells. Jar spells were huge on Witch Talk in 2020 because jar spells are easy to figure out. You just take a jar, consecrate it, and then you put things that correspond to your intention. Let's say you're trying to curse someone. Okay, what are things that relate to cursing? Things that are ruled by either Saturn or Mars. That's the first thing you're going to look to, depending on how you want to curse the situation. And then go, coffin nails, railroad spikes, nasty things like gross stuff, poppy seeds, all those things. You're just going to put that in a jar and be done with it. There are very creative ways to do correspondence as well. Sometimes this gets called sympathetic magic, which is another very easy thing to get into when you're trying to create stuff for the first time instead of just following things. Sympathetic magic, or the law of sympathy, is basically if something is like something, it will do something similar. And so it's an as above, so below idea, but kind of through like a folk magic lens. And a common form of sympathetic magic is the freezer spell, right? Sympathetic magic is really, really literal. So let's say you want to freeze a situation. So you will take a little thing and you'll put correspondences in it, and then you'll put it in the freezer to make it stop. Or alternatively, a very infamous folk magic thing used to do to stop gossip or people running their mouth is to go to the butcher, and you'll look a little bit like a crazy person when you do this, but they won't really ask you as many questions as you think, and ask for a cow tongue or a pig tongue or some sort of tongue. And then you'll take the tongue back to your apartment or house, and you'll do a ritual utilizing the tongue, and you will slash the tongue with a knife, cutting it open. And if your tongue is cut, you won't be able to speak. And so the person who is gossiping or backbiting about you will no longer be able to do that. With sympathetic magic, you can get super, super literal with it, and it's another way to add to a bigger ritual. When you're creating your own things, I think sympathetic magic makes people think more creatively about as above, so below, and it can come up with some really cool stuff. Like a common thing to do if someone has sent bad energy or curses your way is to do a return to sender. And a return to sender is like a really old ritual idea, but one modern way people are doing return to senders is to take like letters and postage and use letters and postage like you're literally returning to sender through the UPS, and then use and consecrate all that and use that as part of your ritual, which I just think is so fun and creative. Like I love the ways you can get thoughtful about sympathetic magic. And if you're only in a group setting and you're like a lower degree member of a group, like you're not going to be able to have all these creative ways of thinking. That just even thinking in these ways and writing these things is going to get you thinking about metaphysics in a completely different way, and is something that is essential to do as a solitary practitioner. Now, when it comes to finding pre-written, pre-made traditional rituals, I think the thing that solitary practitioners are going to struggle with is when you are solitary, you have a lot less direction. You don't have people above you keeping you within a specific tradition. You're very much on your own. So like if you were in an order, like everything that order does is going to be part of, say, Thelema, or say the divine feminine, or say pagan Wicca stuff, or say Alcitru, right? Whereas when you're by yourself, like syncretism is a lot easier to stumble into. And I think it's very natural that people with a heavy solitary dimension to their occult practice are going to be pretty syncretic. It's something I've noticed pretty consistently. So one caution I want to give to solitary practitioners, and this is going to be the biggest mistake I see people make as solitary practitioners, is basically throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall that doesn't match together and having a practice that is incoherent and contradictory. You do not want to do this. If you have a contradictory practice, things aren't going to work exactly how you want them to work, and you're going to be confused. And as you advance, right, years down the line, when you're ready to do some really big, like major rituals, you're going to have so much just doesn't work together. It's going to cause you problems. And you're actually going to end up having to drop parts of your practice. So I'm very syncretic, and I've had to, at various points, leave behind parts of my practice that used to be important to me because they no longer worked with what I was doing. And if you're in a group, since there's such a rigid structure to groups, this doesn't really happen, right? You're always within that confine. Whereas when you're by yourself, you're not within that confine. So you really got to be thinking about stuff more. I believe everyone should have a contemplative practice, but when you're solitary, that contemplative practice needs to be a huge part of your practice, or you're going to end up with a really mismatched practice. And by the way, saying you are a chaos magician, this is one of my biggest pet peeves, does not mean you can do whatever you want. Chaos magic is a paradigm of thinking that is actually quite intellectual. Chaos magic is not being chaotic and like doing random stuff that doesn't make sense together, right? Chaos magic, when they shift between systems, they do this thing called like paradigm shifting, but they're paradigm shifting to see like combine knowledge between multiple systems. And when they paradigm shift, they drop everything and start something new. They don't like weave a bunch of random stuff together that doesn't work, right? You need consistency, right? If you don't have consistency, like there's not going to be a consistent philosophical value underlying your practice. And we need a philosophy to what we're doing, because if you don't have a philosophy to what you are doing, what is your goal, right? These big questions of why am I doing this? What is my true will? What is my purpose? What is my goal of being an occultist are questions that you should be answering over the course of your practice. And if you're not thinking about those early on and you're just doing a bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense together, later on when those questions become more important, it's going to just be super confusing to you. So when it comes to finding rituals, I think the first thing you should consider is, what are my goals? What is my true will? Like, ask yourself all these existential heavy questions that we don't like to ask ourselves. And then once you have like a little bit of an answer, you're not going to have the full answer, because we can't answer these questions without doing mysticism, which is the most funny catch-22 of all time. Once you have like a half answer, a sort of answer, find rituals that align with those goals, right? Don't just do things so they sound cool or exciting. Do things because they make sense with what you want to do. Look at older text, right? Read through the old grimoires, read through the PGM, read through the Keys of Solomon, read through all these things and see what makes sense to you, sticks out to you, and is relevant to what's going on in your life. And then perform the ritual. Now, when you are a solitary practitioner, studying is very important. And when it comes to studying a solitary practitioner, your level of discernment and critical thinking needs to be pretty high, because there's a lot of occult resources out there that I really dislike and think are at the best unhelpful, at worst actively negative and harmful. And I'm not saying this to scare people out of occultism, but there is some stuff out there that is not good. And so having critical thought and a discerning mind and a constant scan for red flags is going to be really, really valuable, because there's a lot out there that you just don't want to mess with. And so be critical of what you're looking at, consider where it comes from. Do your research. Like, if something's making some crazy claim, see what that crazy claim comes from. To find resources, there are books, there are articles, there are YouTube channels, there are podcasts. There are like more resources on occultism now than there have ever been in human history. And in 10 years, there'll be even more than that. So there's like an abundance of resources out there. Just look and use critical thought when engaging with it. So, if you want to begin your occult journey as a solitary practitioner, the first thing to do is to study a bit. I think you should start with a study period, and during that study period, begin doing meditation. And as you get a little better at meditation, start doing visualization work. There's a lot of like visualization exercises that are in books like Psychic Witch, the Golden Dawn curriculum, the Black Brick. There's a lot of them. I believe Liber Null and Psychonaut also has some good like beginner ritual ideas. And before their rituals, they are just kind of exercises. Excuse me, I meant to say exercise, not ritual. I think the countdown exercise is really good, which is where you close your eyes and you visualize a countdown starting at 60, 60, 59, 58, and so on. You visualize the numbers like counting down on a clock or counting down on a chalkboard, and you try to fully focus on those numbers going down. And this will develop a sense of focus that you're going to need in your rituals. As well, I know it doesn't get talked about a lot and it gets kind of crapped on. Things like psionics, which are like energy work techniques, can be really, really good early on. because having a foundation to the house is so, so important. And as a solitary practitioner, you're not going to have people guiding you. So you're really going to need to be self motivated in doing these exercises. I did a lot of exercises when I was new before I started doing rituals, and they built up a lot of skills that I'm glad I had when I started doing rituals. Because if you can't visualize, if you jump straight into an LBRP, which is a very common beginner ritual, you're not even going to know how to visualize because there's a lot of instructions about visualization in that ritual. And so learning to focus, visualize, and understand your energetic body of light and feel the energies within you are going to be really good first skills. And then after they're built up, I really suggest getting an occult book that has a curriculum. I love the Black Brick from the Golden Dawn because it's so exhaustive and long, and it's broken up into these knowledge lectures. And you don't need to be a Golden Dawn practitioner, but just see like the general format of evolution that is in a traditional curriculum and then follow that by yourself. So if you are already in a group, but you have zero solitary practice, which is more common than you would think, start with daily practice and meditation, and then build up to doing rituals by yourself, say once a month on the full moon or twice a month on the full and new moon. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is transitioning. So this would be either transitioning from a solitary to group setting or a group setting to a solitary setting. This could happen for 8 million reasons. This could happen because you realize a group is no longer aligned with your true will, or you move, or alternatively, if you've been solitary for a long time, you want extra guidance or you want to do a formal initiation structure or whatever. Either way this goes, you need to develop a workup mindset, right? It takes 90 days to build a habit. And so if you are solitary going to group, go to a group occasionally in a pattern that is sustainable. Like, don't jump headfirst into going constantly. Like, start with maybe twice a month. And then once that's habit, build up. Now, if you're going from a group setting to a solitary setting, start daily, but small, like 5-minute daily ritual. Because when you're coming out of a group setting, you might be intimidated since group rituals tend to be very long and solitary rituals are often a lot shorter. So start short and get used to the feeling of a short ritual, and then over time build up a full solitary practice. Now, the next thing I want to talk about as a solitary practitioner that I think is really important is temple space. So when you are solitary, your temple is not going to be a beautiful set up temple that's like pre-made for you. You're not going to like go into a building and it be like this gorgeous occult lodge, right? You're going to have to transform your personal space into a temple. And the way that you do that is putting corresponding things in it and keeping it clean. Clean your room. Please, for the love of God, clean your room. And doing regular metaphysical cleansings, right? As well, doing steps like the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, are going to be really important because it will mark this space as your ritual space and then clear it out at the end. Because, most likely your temple space is not going to be a sole temple space. If you have a massive house and you can have a temple room or put out like a garden shed that's your temple, that's amazing. And you should absolutely do that if you can. Goals, I want to be you. But if you can't, you can have a dual purpose space. Dual purpose spaces are not bad. I know so many people who have altars in their bedroom. You just need to make sure you're doing some sort of spiritual activity to mark it as separate and you're maintaining regular spiritual cleansing. If you're a woman, I think it's really fitting to do a big spiritual cleansing right after your menstrual cycle ends. Cleanse yourself and then cleanse your space. It's a very natural time to do all of that. Now, in terms of equipment and tools, you're not going to have a massive amount of tools at first, and you shouldn't. I really don't think it's good to go on Etsy and spend like $700 on ritual tools you don't know how to use. I think it's going to be wasteful, and you're not going to know what to do with it, so it's just going to be pointless. So I suggest buying things over time as you need them. Like, once something is a tool you understand that you know the point of, then buy it and use it. As well, I think DIYing is really valuable. Like, when you start doing rituals that require a chalice or ritual cup, start with a wine glass you own, right? And just consecrate that wine glass. It'll save you a lot of money because these big ceremonial rituals have a lot of tools. Like, even if you strip them down, which I often do, it's still a lot of stuff. So don't be afraid to be DIY and turn stuff you own into more ritual based stuff. Like, that transitioning of things is completely legitimate and is something that pretty much everyone does. So allow yourself to do it. So the very last thing I want to talk about, there's actually quite a few points that I wasn't able to get to for time in this outline, which really sucks. I did not realize that there would be so much I have to say. I might make a follow-up podcast to this. But I think this is the most important thing to stop at. And that is, what do you do when you think you are done being solitary and you think being solitary is no longer enough for you? So if you are at this point, I would start by looking into your community and exploring groups like you're going on a first date, right? Don't show up to a group and go, this is going to be my group for the rest of my life. I'm going to force myself to like them. No, no, no. Like, date it out. Like, go, okay, well, what's the vibe here? Do I get the ick? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What are these people behaving like? And then discern with a few visits if this is a community you want to be part of, then consider initiation. Never just jump straight into something immediately without discernment. As well, if you really like being a solitary practitioner but think you need something like mentorship, there are teaching orders that are decentralized orders that don't have like in-person meetups, but teach each other through like partnering people through the internet. The biggest of these is the AA, which is a Thelemic organization. That's a great option too, right? Building community or doing rituals with other people does not have to be through a traditional group. There are so many occult groups out there that have non-traditional structures that people can really thrive in. And for some people, they just need mentorship, right? They don't need to join a whole order and do a bunch of initiations. Like, they just need a partner, or you know what I mean? Or a community of people who just get together once a month and do group ritual to experience group ritual and aren't like a formal group who all have the same ideology. All of these things are legitimate ways to approach it. And so, in general, our paths are our paths. Not everyone does this stuff the same way, and that doesn't mean the other person is wrong. I think being solitary is really valuable and really transformative. I began as a solitary practitioner, and I'm a solitary practitioner now. I love being solitary. I like being a little bit of a hermit. I don't think it's for everyone, but I think everyone should have a solitary practice angle to their practice, even if it's not the totality of their practice. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you want more podcasts like this, where I'm being a little more instructional instead of commentary based. This podcast is supported through Patreon. If you're on the Patreon, you get a bonus episode every single Wicked Sabbath. So that is 8 times a year. And as well, you get a pre-show, which is a bonus mini episode that I release along every single show. And yeah, that's what comes with the Patreon. The Patreon's super fun and exciting. I also am on most podcasting platforms under the sun and most content creator platforms under the sun. I go by Dot Darling or Georgina Rose on Instagram, YouTube, Substack, Telegram, Instagram. I don't know. I'm everywhere, and I have a personal Patreon. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Please have an amazing morning, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.